Alright, so hello Rebel Scum. Going to go ahead and jump right into the topic discussion of deconstructing the Bible. This time around, starting everything off, I'm going to talk about why the Bible was written. And what I mean by written is why was the canon defined? Now, before I get too much into that, I want to be sure that I explain that there is a difference between a codex and canon. Canon is the arrangement of books, and a codex is the collection of books. So canon is more of kind of an idea of what should or should not be studied, or what is officially considered a document in the faith, while a codex is usually a translation or a gathering of a specific group of documents to basically study or further translate, being passed down throughout the centuries. All right? So starting off, let's go ahead and discuss Old Testament. Old Testament canon is separate from New Testament canon. It was not decided at the same point. It is not technically something that I consider a normally Christian document. Now, we Christians do read it, but the canon was decided upon before Christ came. What is considered the proper Jewish books was around about 400 years prior to Christ. And that's an interesting time period because that's around the time period of the declaration for the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem, which also ties directly into Daniel, if you know anything about that. But we're really getting away from the topic here. So the canon of the Old Testament. Really, when we talk about the canon of the Old Testament, we need to talk about papyrus, which is an invention of the Egyptians. It was actually a plant in Egypt, and so papyrus is actually the name of the plant, but it also became the name of the paper-like material that they used for writing. And because of papyrus and because of other ancient artifacts that are described in Scripture, we place Moses' story and the beginning of his writing around the area of about 1500 BC. Which, of course, is the Bronze Age of human time. And we know that also the Dead Sea Scrolls, if anybody ever talks about them, they are printed and made out of papyrus. So why did Moses in 1500 BC start writing? Well, according to Jewish tradition, Moses began writing the laws as a part of an agreement with God. The reestablishment of the covenants. Now, I personally do believe that Moses also knew the power and the way that writing can unite a people. Writing a history system, creating a legal system, a lot of it, when you actually study it, and there have been studies done, if you've ever taken an ancient world literature course, you will delve into this and you will find that the legal system that Moses created, and a lot of the laws and even some of the praises really coincide and mirror Egyptian laws and praises as well. They are not exactly word for word, but they are pretty close to thought for thought. We also believe that, Moses, while he was the final author of the versions, we're pretty sure, and this is theologians and historians are very sure, that he did not begin writing until after the conquest of Canaan. And more than likely, there were many authors of the laws and scribes that assisted him until the documents were finally entrusted to a priesthood. So while he did pen the final versions and collated it all together, there were many hands on those documents. And after it was given to the priesthood, we even have the recording of Moses' death within those books. Now, the thing is that reading at that time, reading and writing, were not as well upheld, I don't want to say, but we still really relied on the oral tradition. So Moses put together this whole affair, but we slowly see it breaking down after that point until the reign of David about 500 years later. And we see the recording of Jewish and Israel's history at that point began to take off again. And that's pretty much, I think that they began recording it, realizing that what brought the people together and what made the nation strong was recording their history, was recording their laws, was basically presenting something, and education. Education was a huge part of what strengthened their people. And so I think that's why it took off yet again. Now, so we're talking about 1000 BC at that point. Which afterwards we also have the minor prophets, and we basically have the slow downfall of Israel. And it's after that point that the Old Testament canon was finished and declared, which is 400 BC. And with the Old Testament declared, and the canon declared, that again was around the time of the temple being rebuilt in Jerusalem, which was a major part of history. All right. Now, it kind of gets interesting because, of course, we're saying, 1500 to 1000, with the documents being approved and brought together and saying these are the official documents at about 400 BC. And so there's a whole question of, well, prior to Moses and all these claims of Abraham and Noah, what kind of proof do we have to back that up? And the prior experiences with those texts, what we actually have is Sir Henry Rawlinson. Go ahead and write down that name. You can go research him yourself. But he is basically the man that is responsible for the study of what we call Sanskrit. No, sorry, cuneiform. Sorry about that. Cuneiform. And in cuneiform, which he researched in the 1800s, so, almost 2,200 years after the canon was declared for the Old Testament, Sir Rawlinson discovered these clay tablets that were, written in cuneiform, which up until that point, most people had just thought were decorative. But he managed to find a way to translate it, and many of those documents that he found and translated basically backed up the historical tales of many of the tales that Moses wrote about for the Judaic people, which of course brings up an interesting question. Why aren't there translations of the cuneiform writings around today? Why aren't we doing that? Why isn't that in the Bible? And there are several reasons. We're talking about verb and verb tenses, such as the man walking to the mountain, man walked to the mountain, man running to the mountain, man was at the mountain. These are all tenses and verb tenses that really cuneiform doesn't really grasp. And so translating them in any form of direct manner to a modern language is pretty much out the window. While we can look at them and glean the stories and try to understand what it's putting together, and the tales do back them up, having a way to do direct translation is out the window. We're talking about long after any canon has been decided that this was brought out, and so most people don't really feel the need to add it. A lot of people feel that it doesn't contain the same blessing as the Old Testament canon or the New Testament canon, even though it is probably the oldest documents written about the Jewish people. So, interesting tales there. Yes, documents about the Jewish people that predate Egypt. Isn't that amazing? So, anyway, that brings us on to another topic, and that would be after the New Testament, or sorry, after the Old Testament, the declaration of the canon for the New Testament. So, why was everything gathered, and why was a New Testament canon declared? And honestly, it almost wasn't, because even at that time, with the New Testament, people were still relying heavily on oral tradition. It was seen as basically a form passed down directly from Jesus. Jesus, preached. He didn't write. He preached to the disciples to the apostles to the missionaries. And so the missionaries out to their followers. So there was an oral tradition being passed down that these men were so used to. It was something that they declare themselves. Imagine this preacher or rabbi who had dedicated his entire life to memorizing, orally being taught the book of John, and using that as the main thing that he would preach from and teach from and go around and tell people about Jesus. This was, his entire life. And all of a sudden, the idea, the canon was going to change that. It was going to put things into writing. It was going to remove his authority and put authority into the book. Which, like I said, there were many people that were not happy about that. But at the same time, there was another problem, and that was that there were a lot of heretical or apocryphal texts going around at the same time. There were false prophets and sham artists who would basically say, hey, I've discovered a lost book of Paul. And in this book, he declares all these people to be God's people, and he declares that we should do this, and you need to give up your property. And so usually they were finding some way to benefit from this. And I hate to say it, but these people in that time period, many people fell for it. Now, most false prophets were found out and usually dealt with pretty severely, but there were those few cases where people would even just say, hey, I have this book, and it's a translation, and they would just pass it off, and it was false, made up, whatever. And so the church fathers of that time period said, we need to come together, and we need to decide what books are truly the books of, of the New Testament of Jesus Christ. So, you also wanted, at that time, I guess we might as well go ahead and mention Constantine, which, his reign was prior to 300 AD to about 20 or 30 years after 300 AD, and he really wanted to see a unification of the church. He wanted to see everybody come together and unify under, basically his ideas. Sorry, it's true. At the same time, and again, another reason, there was this desire to return to the golden age of, basically what they saw in history of Judaism, by creating books, by creating education, by writing things down, and, it brought forward, usually society would seem to improve. So all these things were done, canon was brought together for all these things. So they had to decide, how are they going to make the canon? How are they going to declare the canon? And it brings up some interesting points because after a certain point, you had other famous church fathers who were writing. Origen, Anathias, all people who wrote past a certain point, whose texts were considered to be very holy, but there was a point with these councils that were declared to decide what was canon, and there was actually a cutoff point decided. And that is, for it to become New Testament canon, while all these documents were considered holy, for it to be considered a canon document, it would have to be written by a recognized apostle, prophet, or a close associate. It would have to have been intended for public reading. It wasn't just a private letter between two people. It was something that was intended to be read out loud. It wasn't just, some simple correspondence. And it had to be consistent with previous revelation, which was the big thing. Several books that are apocryphal in nature. There are books about battling angels that were apocryphal in nature, that, it was a description and an idea and listed names that nobody had ever heard before. And that book was declared apocrypha. It was declared that, no, this was not canon. This is not a book that we can be certain is truly, the Word of God. So, canon started being declared. We saw in Western canon the foundation of the Mertonian canon in about 170 AD. And that was by Pope Pius of Rome. But it was incomplete. it did not contain Hebrews, James, 1st or 2nd Peter. And so if you ever hear people talking about the officialness of the Muratorian canon, usually they really don't know what they're talking about, because the Muratorian canon was incomplete, but it is the most influential for later scholars. Later scholars would add to those names, but it was incomplete. And anybody who says that we reject everyone else and we stick to Muratorian, they're not being honest, because the Muratorian canon didn't have everything. And you won't find Bibles who don't have the later canon. Now again, Muratorian canon influenced Anathias, it influenced Origen, and it influenced Jerome. But we'll get to those names much later on. Now, in about 200 AD, we had the Old Latin translation, or Old Latin canon, which also was missing the exact same documents, and it was by Jerome. And Jerome is a very important figure to keep in mind when we discuss Christian history. His name is very important. Not only did he create the Old Latin canon, but he went on to write a codex, which is the codex that Gutenberg translated. So it's a really interesting history when you think of the name Jerome. So eventually, though, you have the Synods of Hippo in 393 AD, and you have the Synods of Carthage in 397. Both of these basically came together and declared the canon at this point, to have all the major books that we now see in what Protestants use for the Bible. The Catholics have gone back and added several apocryphal books, and they call it the Apocrypha, so they do acknowledge that it is not a part of the original canon. Now these books, these lists of books, were later upheld by the French Confessions of Faith in 1559, and the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1647. So that is pretty much the true history of the gathering of what are the books declared to be canon in the in the New Testament, and pretty much the Bible that you use. Now there are people who use a different Bible that we do not often discuss because they don't have as much emphasis here in the Western world, and that be the Old Syriac translations. The Old Syriac translation. So Syria had its own Christian movement. It had its own Christian churches, and they existed for a couple hundred years. But the translations, they defined and declared their canon by about 400 AD. And these are the books that we now know would end up in many of the Orthodox traditions. The ancient Coptic canon that was from the region, for those first 400 years, though, would only contain the Gospels and then the writing of John. So most of the letters of Paul are completely left out of the Syrian Bible, which is really an interesting thought when you think of it. So you have the tales of Jesus, and then you have the tales of John, but you are leaving out a huge chunk of the Bible, the New Testament, by leaving out Paul. I mean, really spend some time and think about that. All the different letters that he wrote, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians. It's amazing when you start to think about it. Anyway, hopefully this sheds a little bit of light onto the concept of what canon is, when the Bible was actually gathered. I'm going to go ahead and eventually I'm going to make a video about the codexes. Now the codexes are the actual books that are being translated. And that is where we get into a lot more of the aggressive grounds within mainstream Christianity. It is basically a very argumented idea. What codexes people translate from. In fact, if you don't know, there are so many different variations of translations of the Bible in English alone, based on different codexes. Now, I'll address that next time. next time. But, I think that it is definitely something that people will enjoy hearing about, because a lot of times some of the most misused and misunderstood theology comes from these arguments. And I'll start off there next time. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this one.